Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic is the Enlightenment. Now, before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why. Be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. Now, once again, this is that fourth of these huge monumental events that is not a singular entity in not only European history, but in world history. You have the Renaissance, the rebirth. You have the Reformation, the change of religion. You have the scientific revolution. And you have the Enlightenment. These are the four monumental pillars of our modern society. And again, they're all very interconnected. And you can't necessarily have one without the other. They evolve from each other. But and even though they don't take place even in the same century, the evolution that takes place from one to the other and how they interplay with each other have completely transformed global history. So what is the Enlightenment? Well, ultimately the Enlightenment is an emergence of a secular worldview. For the first time in human history, there's this fundamental notion that natural science and reason could explain all aspects of life. And as we mentioned, so you can explain all natural phenomena now. Now, again, there's still a spiritual realm possibly. We're not denying the existence of God. This is not atheistic specifically. But it's the belief in the autonomy of man's intellect separate from God. And there would even be those who would say, well, God gave you this intellect, so use it. And so the basic, if you want to break it down to its most basic assumptions, faith in reason rather than faith in God's revelation. In other words, you've been given the ability to figure things out in your head. You don't need to pray and ask for a divine revelation for you to understand something. That is what the Enlightenment basically taught. Now, what this did lead to, we mentioned this briefly in our last lecture in regards to scientific revolution. Because when you start applying the scientific revolution and Enlightenment ideals in regards to religion, what we actually develop here is a new style of religion known as deism. That's D-E-I-S-M. And deism, if you want to give a definition, it would be the religious arm of the Enlightenment. So here's what it is. Again, deists do not deny God. Again, when I'm talking about God here, I'm talking about the Christian God, Jehovah God. Even though I would argue that most of them did not give necessarily a lot of thought to that. What they actually believe and deists believe was that, yes, there is a creator God. That if you're a Christian, that God created the world in 6 days, the rest on the seventh day, Genesis account, that's fine. They're good with that. And therefore, God himself, Jehovah God, was a deist creator. He's a deity, right? So he's a deist creator. And the existence of God was, they argued, a rational explanation of how the universe existed and was formed. So that God spoke the universe into existence makes rational sense according to them. But as a deistic creator, he is someone who created everything, created man and woman. He put, they're made in God's image. He's given them the ability to rationally think. He's set in motion these natural laws, whether it's, force laws or gravity or motion. He's developed all these natural laws to govern his creation. In other words, he's like what many of them liken to a cosmic clockmaker. So a clockmaker back in the old days, they make a clock. And if you remember these old clocks, you had to wind them up. So you twist the little knob and you wind them up and they tick, 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 tick. And eventually you have to rewind it, but they can go on some of them for years before you have to touch them. Once you wind the clock, it can go on for I won't say infinite time, but this is God we're talking about, so yes, it could go for infinite. So he's a cosmic clockmaker who created the universe, then he stepped back. He rested. And he left it running like a clock would. Tick, 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 tick. And, or some people call it the ghost in the machine, because he created it all. Yeah, there's some God out there somewhere who created, but he has no real involvement in human life anymore. So he's not the personable God of Joel Osteen. He's not the vengeful God, though, of the Great Awakening. He's not the God you're going to talk to through the priests through the priest in the Catholic Church. He's just this God creator deist who created everything. And yes, should you live by some moral codes? Yes. And in fact, if you go back to U.S. history, many of our founding fathers were not, say, staunch Christians. Yeah, they knew the Bible. They believed the Bible. But many of them were deists who they believed in God. They believed in the moral code of the Bible that should govern mankind so we can get along and have a good country, have a good life. And yes, they argued that natural laws included things like life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. But they were not necessarily on board with all the supernatural miracles. It was said that Thomas Jefferson, in fact, it just recently, sometime in late 2020, it was revealed they actually found a Jefferson Bible where he'd actually cut out all the miracles of God from the Bible. And so he took like a razor blade and literally chopped out verses that mentioned God's miracles. And what was left over was just what Jefferson believed was God's moral code. Because for the most part, remember, the founding fathers of the United States were very much Enlightenment thinkers. They were tremendous readers of the Enlightenment. And so it makes sense then that they believe in this kind of deist idea. And in addition to that, because they realize that you don't necessarily need God to understand natural laws, therefore they also believe that the scientific method could explain the laws of society. And if you want to explain laws of society, what is paramount and tantamount is education. If you want to improve society and see progress, you need education and apply natural laws, the scientific revolution, apply these natural laws to society. So this is taking those natural laws, or you see on my screen right now, it says the Enlightenment is the science of man. It's taking those natural laws that we've been discovering in the scientific revolution and apply it to everyday life, to social government institutions. Apply it to society at large. Now, one of the foremost thinkers here, of course, is John Locke. Now, John Locke in 1689 wrote Essay Concerning Human Understanding. He argued that the mind is what he called a tabula rasa, a blank slate. So when you're born, your mind is blank. You know good nor evil, you know nothing. And therefore, all knowledge you acquire is derived from experience. So therefore, your human development is completely shaped by education and social institutions. Now, this may sound somewhat logical. You may agree or disagree with this, but think about this in the context of the 17th century. This idea of tabula rasa or blank slate theory, it undermines the notion that humans are born sinful. There's this idea, within Christianity that says that, the idea of concept of original sin, that all humans are born sinful and deserving of hell. That's why you need God's forgiveness and salvation. But under the ideas of tabula rasa or blank slate theory, this undermines that notion, because if you are a completely blank slate, everything that you will eventually do is shaped by your environment, your experiences, your knowledge, well, then you learn to do evil or you learn to do good. And of course, the key to this, of course, is education to actually develop this. And so he rejects Rene Descartes, his view that people are born with certain basic ideas and ways of thinking. So between Locke and Descartes, what you're talking here is a situation of nature versus nurture. Are you born a certain way? Or are you nurtured into believing certain things? And this is a really fascinating debate that would be awesome to have in class, because it's a really big deal. And I think personally, I would say it's a little bit of both. Because there are certain things that you just kind of have unique traits you're born with. And yeah, these things can be fostered, they can be deterred, they can be promoted, they can be pushed down based upon those around you, your experiences in life. So there's, in my opinion, again, this is just my opinion from reading the different philosophers over time, that there's a little bit of both going on here. That there's essentially a nature that you're born with. But this idea is nurtured throughout your life, though. Again, I'm not saying whether I fully buy Locke or not, but the ideas are incredibly interesting. Now, on the one hand, this completely undermines the Christian view that humankind is essentially born sinful. So there's that. But remember, the Enlightenment thinkers are not just concerned about this, but that's just philosophy, going back to Descartes. They're also interested in how do you apply this to society? And building off this idea in 1689, this essay, in 1690, John Locke writes his seminal work on the two treaties of civil government. And because humans are basically good, again, they're born good, they learn to do evil. So he argues that this is the state of nature. Humans are basically good but lack protection. Again, this is very different from Hobbes' view that humans were in this state of nature that were brutish and nasty and terrible and vile. So humans are basically good. They lack protection. They lacked the cohesive government to do good. And so in Locke's mind, the purpose of government was to protect those so-called natural rights of the people. So government only exists to protect people and their natural rights that you know them, you love them: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Or, I got news for you, that was not in the original John Locke. John Locke did not mention pursuit of happiness. That was added later. For John Locke, it was life, liberty, and property. Then John Locke took it one step further. He also argued that people have a right to rebellion. People have a right to rebel and abolish a government that does not protect natural rights, life, liberty, and property. And of course, if you go back to the ideas of the American Revolution, all men are created equal, given some certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Why? What was the reason for rebelling against Great Britain? Because they felt their natural rights were being trampled. These ideas of John Locke, you can understand, are very important in history. You cannot understate how important John Locke is to the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and of course these inspire the other revolutions in Latin America, etc. And John Locke kind of gets this ball rolling. And what we find out of here is we have a group of men, the Enlightenment thinkers, known as the Philosophes. Now, the Philosophes, they were committed to reform society. Much like John Locke, these men want to apply this natural law, this rational thought, to government. What they see around them is excess. They see corruption. And they want to reform this. They want to reform not only government, in society. And so the Philosophes are these group of thinkers and writers who create enlightened ideas, dedicated to exposing real societal problems and proposing solutions. Now, many, many, many were French. Now, there were some found other places in Europe, including in the American colonies. Some of our founding fathers were Enlightenment thinkers. Now, why France? Well, the majority of the Enlightenment thinkers lived in intolerant, absolutist societies. So many of their ideas, the exposing corruptions, proposing solutions, was about seeing what was going on around them. And for them, places like England, the idea of constitutional monarchies, that kind of fit with their thought process. But seeing something like France, this huge country, one of the most populous countries in all of Europe, and under an absolutist monarch that under their whims, their follies, and they're the ones who are writing and speaking out against this. Now, the reality is they were extremely successful in popularizing the Enlightenment, even though these were technically not professional philosophers like Descartes and Locke. So there's a difference here. Descartes and Locke are professional, educated philosophers at university. The philosophes are just thinkers. They believed in what was called capital P progress. Now, you're going to write a paper later this year. And on this idea of what is capital P progress. And I say capital P progress for a reason. Is there's two kinds of progress. There's, we're going to, progress through this semester, progress through this book. We're going to make progress. That's lower P progress. Though lower P progress are the events that we're going to do to get to an expected end. So you're going to write a paper, you're going to read a chapter, you're going to read a book. This is all hallmarks of stepping stone progress. But if we have to do these things to achieve what's called capital P progress. Capital P progress is that we are going to get to full equality under the law. We're going to get to full economic equality, full social equality, where everyone is seen as equal, even though they may look or sound different. Where there is no prejudice. That is capital P progress. How do we get to capital P progress of a essentially utopian society? Now, we may never get there, but we want to strive for that capital P progress to make the world a better place. And that's what these Enlightenment thinkers want to do. They want to get to capital P progress. If you think back to US history, the progressive era, that was capital P progress. It was using the government to create better equality, better safeguards, and use the government to regulate the worst impulses of capitalism to achieve capital P progress. That's what progressives were. So they attempted to do. Did they always succeed? No. Were some of the things they tried to pass actually fail miserably and set back progress? Yes. But it was that idea of striving for capital P progress. And that's what the philosophes wanted, capital P progress. And they are radically, at least in the early years, optimistic that about how people should live and govern themselves, that we can achieve this. Now, I'll be honest, as we move forward to the end of the Enlightenment era, things are getting more pessimistic. It kind of reflects the way we talked about the Renaissance, right? Initially, Michelangelo was very hopeful, the Sistine Chapel. It was bright, it was colorful. But by the end of that period, they start seeing more disillusionment. They start seeing that these ideas are great, they're wonderful, but they're not being implemented, and thus things are failing. And I think that this is one of those big keys that in the early days, they are quite optimistic. But as we see, as time goes on, they become more and more pessimistic. Now, one of the first great thinkers is Voltaire. Now, again, he's French. And he is perhaps the most influential of all the Enlightenment philosophers. He would write sharp satire and criticism that will ridicule those with whom he disagreed. He loved sarcasm, he liked satire. He challenged traditional Catholic. Remember, he's in France, it's a Catholic country. He has strong deist views. He believed prayers and miracles did not fit with natural laws. He believed that human reason was the key to capital P progress in society, not religious faith. When he looked at faith and religion, all he saw was war and division. He hated bigotry. He hated injustice. and he did call for religious toleration. And Voltaire was raised a Christian, but he came to distrust organized religion as corrupt. And he believed that the organized religion and its leadership had moved away from the core central message of the teachings of Jesus. And even once, he at one point in his life actually said, within 100 years, Christianity will cease to exist. Now, fun little fact, apparently they actually started selling or giving out Bibles from his old home. But again, this was that for him, again, right or wrong, he believed that Christianity needed to cease to exist because it was creating warfare and turmoil, and they moved away from the teachings of Jesus to the point where it was harming society. And so for him, Catholic progress was getting rid of organized religion. Again, he was technically not atheist. He was deist. Now, what he did advocate for as far as government goes, that was society. What about government? In government, he advocated for what he called enlightened despotism. So he does believe in absolutism. He's an absolutist country, but what he wants them to do is that he wants these despots, these absolute rulers, to be enlightened. Because he believed that people were essentially incapable of governing themselves. They needed someone to govern them. So unlike Locke, who was much more of that social contract idea that between the royalty, the monarch, and the people, Voltaire does believe that we need a strong man. But he needs to do so with enlightened reforms. And he did believe in equality he believed in equality before the law, but not necessarily equality between the classes. So he's still a product of his era. In the whole estate system, the first, second, and third estate, he does believe that there are differences between the rich and poor. So even these Enlightenment thinkers are not, utopian thinkers necessarily. They don't want everyone to be equal. They're not communists, basically. And then we have Baron de Montesquieu. Now, Montesquieu is a member of the French nobility who detested the absolutism of Louis XIV. Big surprise, right? He's a nobleman who's seen his power dwindle. And in the midst of this under Louis XIV, he writes in 1748, "The Spirit of the Laws is an attempt to create a social science by applying natural laws to government studies." Let me repeat that. It's an attempt to create a social science by applying natural laws to governmental studies. He calls for the separation of powers into three branches: monarch, nobility, rest of the people. Now again, while this is not something we will ever adopt in the United States, it is, however, this basis of separation of powers. You needed checks and balances. Because in his mind, again, monarchy, nobility, the rest of the population. The goal is to prevent tyranny and promote liberty. Principle of checks and balances to ensure no single branch of government became too powerful. And he actually favored the British system of monarch, parliament, independent courts. Again, many Enlightenment thinkers look to Great Britain because of the idea of the constitutional monarchy. And of course, his ideas had a significant impact on both the French Revolution and, of course, the US Constitution. Number 3 on the list, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, Rousseau is the one who really began to articulate the idea of what's called a social contract. He believed that there is too much of an emphasis on property and not enough consideration for people, which was the root cause of social injustice. In other words, there's too much, it's all about me and my private property and my business, but that becomes the cause then of social racial injustice. Now, he's not talking about race at this point, but apply it to modern day social injustice issues. And he says the general will, this general will is what he advocated for. That he argued a general will, the consensus of society, should control the nation. So the general will, any action that is right and good for all. Now, does he ever use the word democracy? No. But his ideas are what give light to our modern ideals of democracy. This strongly implies democracy. Now, the downside to the idea of using a popular vote or a popular will, the general will, is that you will always then have a minority whose viewpoints are not recognized. Again, I'm not trying to be political about United States history right now, but there's an argument to be made that while, as of we sit here in October 2020, is the general will of the people actually being heard right now in the U.S. government? Because you have a president who lost the popular election by 2.7 million votes. In addition, in the Senate, while there is 2 senators per state, that is equal. Again, by the voting population, where population actually rests in our country, I mean, is it fair that California gets 2 votes with far more people than, say, Montana, who also gets 2 senators? And so you can make an argument that even in the Senate, where it's designed to be equal, that technically a minority party, the Republican Party, which again, based on the last election, was a minority party based on popular vote, that the minority is actually the only view being expressed right now. And so there are 2 sides to the general will idea of Rousseau that can be problematic. Either a minority does not get heard, or in the case of the United States, only the minority party is being heard right now. Again, this is not to cause shade or try to influence one way or the other, but this is what the downside to Rousseau and the idea of democracy is. Now, please note, though these ideas seem to support democracy, the way he writes the idea of the general will is very ambiguous. It will be later manipulated by dictators to rationalize extreme nationalism and tyranny. So leaders get elected or appointed by the people, and they feel they have that popular mandate. And they use that as a pretense to become dictators. And the most easy, quick example that we'll talk about later this year is Robespierre, who takes over after the fall of the French monarchy in the French Revolution. He'll go basically crazy. Now, what's interesting, though, is we generally consider Rousseau an important Enlightenment thinker, and he is. But the reality is he is actually more accurately seen as the founder of the spin-off movement known as the Romantic movement. However, he is very unique because he distrusted both reason and science. He trusted emotion and spontaneous feelings more than cold logic, hence the idea of democracy. How you feel is how you vote, what you want. Now, one of his most famous works, of course, is Emile, and it's presented his ideas like a novel. And he believed in a very progressive education, learn by doing, and that children should draw their own conclusions from experience. In other words, your experiences shape your surroundings. Therefore, children should not necessarily be forced to believe what the parents believe, but rather learn from their own experiences. Ironically, he actually had 5 illegitimate children, and he abandoned them to an orphanage instead of educating them. So there's that. Next on our list is Denis Diderot. And Diderot is perhaps the greatest and most representative work of the philosophes. He was a compendium of both political and social critiques from Enlightenment philosophies and authors. And he's the one, while he has his own thoughts, he's the one who's going to compile all these works into basically a compendium, an encyclopedia. And he's going to help popularize the views of the philosophes and to push the idea of thinking critically and objectively. Now, much like Voltaire, he's going to emphasize science and reason while criticizing religion, intolerance, injustice, and tyranny. Now, funny story, his encyclopedia was actually banned in France, and it was by the Pope, would place it on the index of prohibited books. But incredibly important book because it does bring everything together. Next up is Marquis de Beccaria. And he's the one who's going to write on crimes and punishment. And again, each philosopher has their own unique thing that they're going to focus on. And his issue was to humanize criminal law based on Enlightenment concepts of reason and equality before the law. So punishment, he argued, for the crime should be based on rationale on the damage done to society. So use rationale, right? Rationally look at the situation. So what is the crime? What is the harm done to society? It should not be linked to some religious concept of sin, but rather, what is the damage on society? Give an appropriate punishment. For the most part, he opposes capital punishment, the death penalty, barring a serious threat against the state. He opposes torture to extract confessions. And his views will ultimately influence those enlightened despots that we'll talk about in the next lecture. In fact, many nations, as a result of the writings of Marquis de Beccaria, are actually going to ban torture as a way to extract or punish. Not all nations got that memo, apparently, and even though the United States was a very avid reader of the Enlightenment thinkers, you remember my story of the Philippines last year, we definitely believe in torture. Now, next on our list, so this is kind of your one sheet here of what they believe in. Again, reason, natural laws, happiness, progress, capital P progress, liberty, and of course, toleration, especially in religion. So take a screenshot, look at this picture. This is kind of a quick summary of the basic key ideas. So this is about how to apply it to society and politics. How do you apply it to economy? And we see a couple important figures here, including Francois Quesnay. And Francois is the leader of the physiocrats in France who began to oppose mercantilist policies. He sought to reform the existing agrarian system by instituting laissez-faire in agriculture. He believed the French government nobility had way too much control over the land, which was stifling agricultural production. In other words, let the farmers farm. Stop micromanaging from above. And what he advocated for was this idea of laissez-faire, a policy of non-interference with the economy. So he begins to get that ball rolling. So mercantilism is bad. It's micromanaging, it's extracting, it's stifling creativity and production. We should step back as a government, as nobles, and let them be. The person who refines this and takes this idea and runs with it, of course, is the great Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith will refine and expand that laissez-faire philosophy. See, applying that scientific revolution and Enlightenment rationale, he believed that the economy is governed by natural laws of supply and demand. So again, natural laws. But it's governed by natural laws of supply and demand. And in a free market, competition will encourage producers to manufacture more efficiently in order to sell higher quality, lower cost goods than their competitor. So competition is the key along with supply and demand. Government regulation only interferes with this natural self-governing style. This is a very utopian view that when applied is going to have some issues, but nonetheless, his most famous work, of course, in 1776 is The Wealth of Nations, considered the quote-unquote Bible of capitalism. Economic laws of supply and demand will create a self-regulating system, i.e. the free market. Regulations like tariffs only hinder free trade should be abolished. Self-interest motivates individuals by the invisible hand of competition to act as an automatic regulator so the market will generate wealth for the nation and for themselves. In other words, this is capitalism. Adam Smith. Now, much like the scientific revolution, who had the academies open up to, compare and contrast and, connect with each other, the Enlightenment ideas will often be spread through the writings of the encyclopedia, but more importantly, they exchange ideas in places called salons. And again, these are often hosted by women in private homes, their coffee houses, or in places of higher academia, where they would just get together and talk and discuss these new ideas and how to refine their ideas. So again, you picture, they sit down at a Starbucks, they all sit down, have their latte, and they begin to converse and talk. It's a wonderful idea that would be really lovely to be able to do in real life. Boy, I miss doing that. Again, quick chart for you to take down, comparing the two ideas between mercantilism of Colbert and Adam Smith's capitalism. But jot it down, take a note. What about women? You see, the philosophes did favor increased rights and education for women. And some even advocated for voting rights, so political rights. There we go. So you can read that. Women would play a major role in the salon movement because they are the ones who are often hosting these men and would often take part in the discussions, at the very least become educated as a result of being there. Some of the brightest minds of the Enlightenment assembled in these salons, and women were the ones who organized and took part in the discussions, including Madame Geoffrin. Geoffrin will play a major role in patronizing Diderot's encyclopedia. She will help curate it. She will help distribute it. Now, there were some Enlightenment thinkers, including Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who made a very distinct distinction between the public sphere that's dominated by men and the private sphere dominated by women. And thus, the Enlightenment thinkers were not very enlightened when it came to the role of women. Many still believed that men belonged in the public sphere, women belonged in the private sphere. And you'll note this is something we talked about last year in U.S. history with this idea of public sphere and private sphere for men and women. And people like Rousseau would argue that there are natural, knows the term natural again, differences between men and women. And therefore, women should concentrate their talents on the domestic sphere as wives and mothers. Now, very famously, Mary Wollstonecraft on your right, she will challenge Rousseau's opinion on excluding women from society. And there will become more political and educational equality for women as a result of not only her work, but women in the Enlightenment in general. Now, as we move to late 18th century, the Enlightenment becomes more skeptical and even atheistic. And we're going to kind of go through these really quickly here. But some would argue the late Enlightenment thinkers undermined the main intent of the earlier Enlightenment because they became more skeptical and cynical. And they seem to be centered on two camps of thought. Number one, the later thinking undermined the good the early thinkers did by their cynicism. And number two, there are those who believe that, no, this was just the natural evolution of the Enlightenment. So in other words, we started out as deists, but now we're moving to atheists because it's just a natural progression, right? This is progress under the Enlightenment ideal. So on the one hand, there are those who think, no, you are completely undermining all the good that was being accomplished by thinkers like Voltaire. But then there's the other camp that says, no, this is the evolution. This is what progress looks like. And so you have three main people you guys are supposed to know here. And the first one is Baron Paul de Holbach. He argued that humans were essentially like machines, completely determined by outside forces. So you're taking away the idea of free will, the idea of emotion, and instead he focused on what's called determinism. And this idea completely undermines Christianity. Because the idea of determinism says, no, you have no responsibility for yourself necessarily, but yet you are completely determined by outside forces that are acting upon you. Now, you can make the argument this is a positive thing, that people need to act good toward people, and that is true. But it is a very, very kind of dark atheistic view where you have no personal responsibility whatsoever. Second on the list is David Hume. He argued against faith in both natural law and faith. He's very, again, skeptical. He claimed that human ideas were merely the result of sensory experiences. And thus, human reason could never go beyond what they experienced through their senses. And again, this is a very kind of narrow view. So a peasant can never be more than a peasant because they can't go beyond their sensory experiences. And it really undermines the Enlightenment ideals of reason in capital P progress. However, the greatest of all these three was Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant was a German philosopher of the Enlightenment. He began to separate science and morality into separate branches of knowledge. Science could describe nature, but it could not provide a guide for morality. Instead, he believed in what's called the categorical imperative. It was an intuitive instinct placed by God in human conscience. So he's not atheist. In other words, God does give you essentially a conscience. He called it the categorical imperative. And it creates both an ethical and aesthetic appreciation for human beings. And ultimately, he is the one who's going to kind of bring hope to this late Enlightenment period. Because reason is a function of the mind, beyond the ideas of science. We're trying to separate it. Understand that, yeah, there's a science part of it. But when it comes to morality, you need some kind of inner voice to guide you. And he called it the categorical imperative. Now, ultimately, the political outgrowth of the Enlightenment became known as classical liberalism. And it grows really out of Immanuel Kant. And it's the belief in liberty of the individual and equality before the law. So classical liberalism is the idea that we should have liberty of the individual and equality before the law. But no, this is not democracy still. They still believe in the idea that there should be a ruler on top. Natural rights philosophy will play a profound role, of course. So to kind of sum up this three things, okay? So politically, there's the liberty of the individual, equality before the law, not democracy. So, but you have liberty of the individual, equality before the law. Number two, you have natural rights that play a profound role in future revolutions, American and French. So we have natural rights. And then number three, we have this laissez-faire capitalism. So economically speaking, we apply the Enlightenment ideals to the economy, and you get capitalism. Government should be laissez-faire. No more mercantilism. And then the last thing, kind of bring it all together here, is this belief in capital P progress that is only developed through reason and education. That's going to promote equality and human happiness. Now, to achieve this, yes, we need freedom of speech. We need freedom of the press. We need religious toleration. We need just punishments. You know, those things that are all found in the Bill of Rights, right? Now, what's interesting here is how do Christians respond to this? Well, the secular and very deist views of Enlightenment caused a strong, staunch reaction from Christian leaders who believed that Christian spirituality was on the decline. And what we get here instead then is, let me get my screen so you can read this, is we start seeing a couple of new sects that emerge as a response to the Enlightenment period. The first one is Methodism, brought to you by John Wesley, of course, Methodist Church. And he's the one who begins to teach the need for spiritual regeneration and live a moral life to demonstrate that you have been born again. In other words, you want to prove you're a Christian, you need to have the spiritual regeneration of a born-again experience, and you must live a moral life. Again, the reason for this is very important. And let's go on to Jainism, or Jansenism there. And this is a Catholic sect that in France that argues against the idea of an uninvolved or impersonal God. Now, they did believe in predestination. But what's important about both Jansenism and Methodism is that this is a response to the Enlightenment ideal of a deist, impersonal God. They believe that, yes, humans can connect to God. They still need God. And so whereas the Enlightenment things were often deists, some later ones atheists, that really said you don't need God to understand the world. God's this impersonal creator God out there in the middle of nowhere who has no interaction with his creation. These new denominations, sects of religion, are there to say, no, you need a relationship with God. You need God to be born again. You need God to be in your life. And the idea is that you can communicate with God. So how do we end this? What are some legacies here? Well, we do have the emergence of a secular worldview. Ultimately, we'll see the American French revolutions as a result of classical liberalism, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. We will see educational reform in various countries. And as we'll see in our next lecture, we will see the emergence of enlightened despotism in places like Prussia, Russia, Austria, and ultimately France. But until we talk about that next time, take care and bye-bye.